The Bain Capital-owned firm Varsity Brands facing a bit of scrutiny right now, even after mass layoffs. The company, which is a central part of the cheerleading community, has been called a, quote, cash flow machine. They bring in a reported $185 million even during the pandemic.
Research Director for the American Economic Liberties Project, Matt Stoller, joins us now to discuss. Matt, this has been one of your pet things to highlight for a long time. Lay it out, both how you were inspired and learned about all of this and what's going on here.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. So there's a big debate about the American economy and whether big corporations are big and powerful because they're just better at stuff, their technology is costly and there are network effects, or whether the law has allowed for monopolization, more monopolization. And why I like to study this market of cheerleading is because it really shows that it's all the law. There are no economies of scale. There's no technology in cheerleading. It's cheerleading. It's just, young people doing incredibly difficult gymnastics that are super dangerous and like really impressive. And so the roll up of this industry, like a youth sport by a private equity firm, Bain Capital, in this holding company called Varsity Brands, really tells you something about the American economy.
And Matt, just break down for us, what is the experience of the families participating in cheerleading because as a direct result of this monopolization?
Right. Well, it's just very expensive. So what Varsity Brands does is they have acquired most of the contests, and they also finance the nonprofit, the United States All-Star Federation. And then there are some other nonprofits that write the rules for the sport. So if you want to enter a contest or you want to plan a contest, you effectively have to go through Varsity, and they tell you through the USASF what the rules are. They can sort of influence who wins. And so what they end up doing is they say, well, you have to buy our apparel, you have to buy our equipment, you have to pay our fees. And so it's really expensive. It can cost, $10,000, $20,000 a year to have your kid doing cheerleading. And look, this is where their, kids, all their best friends are on the team. And so, it's just really expensive. Some parents have to get a second job to actually have their kids stay in cheerleading. And these are also anchors of the community. So to have them controlled by a private equity firm that's just kind of price gouging is, it's just characteristic of the American economy these days.
See, that's really interesting. And I learned from the Netflix documentary Cheer about how important it is to the lives of so many. Great documentary, by the way.
I love that documentary.
And Matt, here's one thing I'm curious. Extrapolate this across the rest of the economy. Why it's important. What does the government have to do with any of this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And by the way, I was inspired to go into this story because of Cheer. There was like a 3-minute segment on Cheer where they talked about how Varsity controls everything. And my colleague, Sarah Miller, was like, that looks like a monopoly. So I looked into it, and sure enough, it's like John D. Rockefeller, but glittery. But what the government allowed the mergers to happen. And the big one was in 2015, was a company called Jam Brands, which ran a lot of contests. And Varsity bought them. There were people in the community that complained to the Federal Trade Commission saying you should block this merger, but the FTC didn't do anything about it. But also, there are class action antitrust suits against Varsity Brands for the various things that they're doing. And so the weakening of antitrust law makes those suits harder to bring. But if antitrust law were stronger, then you would have, a lot of the things that Varsity does wouldn't be legal, and it would just be a much kind of fairer marketplace. And the incentives wouldn't be there to roll up all the contests because you just couldn't profit from it the same way.
Yeah, I want to dig into that a little bit more because correct me if I'm wrong. I mean, they sell the apparel, they run the contests, they also run the rulemaking body. I mean, every aspect of this sport is controlled by this one monopoly. And the narrow, my understanding, you have much deeper knowledge on this than I do, but my understanding is that the narrow rule that they continue to use to determine whether something's a monopoly is whether it increases costs and hurts consumers in that one way of price going up. Here you have a clear example where prices are going up because of the monopoly, yet it's still allowed to go through. So is this a case of the laws are insufficient or the laws are not being enforced sufficiently?
Why not both? I mean, that's there. There are debates in antitrust about whether you determine whether you determine if there's a monopoly based on price effects or price theory, So, which gets to the question of, is antitrust supposed to promote efficiency, or is it supposed to promote essentially democracy and distributed power? And the people who's talked about efficiency, they said, well, we need to look at consumer prices. But even by their own standard, consumer prices in a lot of markets, and not just cheerleading, but like, look at, say, pharmaceuticals, hospitals, prices are really high and they keep going up. And when you have mergers in concentrated markets, consumer prices tend to go up. So even by their own standards, the sort of consumer welfare, pro-monopolist types have failed, but the harms go way beyond just consumer prices. So you're right that the laws aren't being enforced even by their own standards, but also the laws are insufficient.
Yeah, such a crazy story. Thanks for bringing it to our attention, Matt.
Great to see you, Matt. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Of course. And we'll have more Rising for you after this.